Now that most of our internal engine parts are clean, there are a few external ones that we'll need to take care of. Because these parts have been and will be exposed to the elements, they'll need a little bit more care and protection after cleaning than the other parts. We'll get started with one of the more complicated parts and one of the worst filth offenders, the timing cover. This thing is entirely coated in grime on the outside and is going to need some soaking in the degreaser. I'll give it a quick initial wipe down, then a rinse, and a bit of scrubbing, and then we'll drop it beneath the work surface and let it soak in the parts washer. After 3 hours of soaking, the vast majority of the grime is easily coming off. We can also peel out what's left of the front oiled pan gasket seal. But we'll give it a bit more time to soak and put it back in the parts washer to leave it overnight. Coming back to it, we'll give it a rinse and scrub off as much oil and grime as we can. After a few minutes of this and one final rinse, it's actually looking pretty good. But it still has the main seal installed in it, so we'll take it over to the bench and get ready to remove that. The timing tab makes this a bit awkward, so I kinda set it on a board and started by using a punch and a hammer to knock it loose. But the seal was really held in there, and that round punch wanted nothing to do with it. After 5 minutes of hammering on it, the steel was pretty deformed, but unfortunately hadn't moved. I tried to switch tactics by finding some kind of a way to use a pry bar as a seal puller, but it was just starting to bend the entire timing cover instead of pulling out the seal. But it must have done something to help, even if it was just deforming the seal or the cover even more, because after switching back to the punch, pretty quickly the seal popped out. And with that mangled thing finally out of the way, we're gonna switch over to the gasket scraper to clean up the rear surface of the cover. First, we need to scrape off the paper gasket that seals between the timing cover and the engine block. Then we need to scrape off all the RTV and stuck rubber from the oil pan seal. This ended up being pretty difficult, and I had to use a flat blade screwdriver to scrape a lot of it off. But eventually, things were looking decent enough, and we could move forward. The last thing I wanted to do with this cover before sandblasting it was to remove these two vestigial tabs. This first one on the lower portion of the cover is just a little eyelet. I really don't know what this one is for, but we're not going to be using it and it might get in the way, so we're just going to use the Sawzall to cut it right off. The second, much larger tab is the one for the secondary timing pointer. It was folded over, presumably from the factory, and entirely useless to us. So that's also going to get sawed off. Which was a little bit easier said than done, but after reclamping everything, the saw finally got through it. We'll use the belt sander to round those corners over, make sure there's no sharp edges, and try to make it look like it came this way originally. After a few minutes of that, here is our prepped timing cover. It's still looking a little bit gross, admittedly, but it's at least good enough that it's ready for the sandblaster. It's important to keep oil and engine bay grime out of there because that will really clog things up, but we've managed to get the timing cover at least free of that. We made a video a little while back about setting this cabinet up, so it's about time we use it for something actually useful. Yeah, I could just go buy a new timing cover, but I feel like that's missing the point. It's way more interesting to take this old one and make it look new. Or at least as new as anything else on the engine. We'll switch on the shop vac to keep the blaster from pressurizing and to keep the air inside relatively clear. For our media, we're mostly just using play sand because it's what I had easy access to and, well, it's cheap. It's not the fastest solution in the whole world, but it is definitely getting the job done. As much as possible, we'll keep the nozzle at a relatively low angle to help lift anything on the surface up and to increase the recirculation life of that sand. Eventually, it'll be broken up into finer and finer particles, which will make it much less useful for the cleaning we need to do. At the moment though, it is definitely doing the trick, and all of the paint, rust, and anything else left on that cover is coming right off. We're aiming for as even a surface finish as possible, though of course this will be painted, so that isn't entirely necessary. Once the outside of the cover is looking spiffy, we can flip it over and get to the sealing surfaces on the inside. I was originally only going to focus on the outer edges, but for the sake of the video and for you all, I decided to make it as clean as possible. Unless the paint was flaking off or something, there's not really a reason to clean the inner surface, but I kinda figured I might as well. All in all, it took about 20 minutes of blasting to get the cover to this point. Really, it could have been done in about 5, but I figured I would make an example out of this part and make it as nice looking as I could get it. And here is what came out of that blast cabinet. There's not the slightest hint of rust or paint left anywhere on it. I am very happy with the transformation this thing went through. Even the timing markings came out looking immaculate, and they are way more readable than they were before. The blasting also helped to hide the cuts that I made when removing the other timing tab. Unless you were really looking at that edge, you probably wouldn't notice that anything was ever there. The only thing the blasting cabinet didn't totally remove were these last little traces of RTV sealer. So we'll have to go back and finish scraping those off, but otherwise we are pretty much done here. The last thing we have to do to this timing cover is get it really clean. Obviously, play sand isn't something we want inside of our engine, so we'll have to do everything we can to make sure it stays out. We'll use good old-fashioned soap and water and a plastic bristle brush to clean every facet of the cover. We'll be paying special attention to the inner surface, of course, but we also want to make sure the outer surface is totally clean so that paint can hold on to it. Once it's been scrubbed thoroughly, we'll rinse it off in another bucket of clean water and spray it down with the hose. Then we'll use the blowgun on the air compressor to dry it off as quick as we can. Between the sandblasting removing all the paint and the soap and water wash removing any oily residues, this thing will rust very quickly if we don't keep it dry. So we'll take our time and be very thorough in the drying process. After this, we sprayed it down with WD-40 and surrounded it with plastic wrap to keep it pristine until we're ready for reassembly. Another part that'll be getting the same treatment is the harmonic balancer. It looks to be in pretty good shape, and to get an even better look, we'll give it an initial rinse in the parts washer. To avoid damaging the rubber in the balancer, we won't be submerging it, just rinsing it off with degreaser and rubbing it down with a wire brush. Using that brush and rubbing down the balancer with red Scotch-Brite did a lot to help clean it up. Despite all that though, it still ended up looking a bit ragged. This was mostly due to rust and peeling paint. The rubber portion and the front seal surface appear to be in fine shape. In order to get this looking a bit nicer and ready to match the rest of the engine, we'll put this in the sandblaster. It was able to bring that whole thing down to bare metal pretty quickly. The old paint and years of rust flew right off. I'd say that's a pretty stark before and after. Now you can actually see all the timing marks around the outer rim. Unlike with the degreaser, I wasn't worried about damaging any of the exposed rubber, because at the pressures we're working with, any sand hitting it would just bounce right off. You may also note that I didn't tape off the front seal surface. This, like many other things on the engine, was a little bit of an experiment. The surface wasn't super smooth, but sandblasting it definitely roughed it up a bit. We'll repolish that with some red Scotch-Brite to try to return at least some of the original surface finish. I'm really not sure how rough this surface is going to be on that front seal, so we'll just have to wait and see how it does. Once that polishing seems satisfactory, we'll give the balancer a thorough wash. Just like the timing cover, we're brushing it down with soap and water. We'll get it as clean as we can, rinse it off, spray it dry, and then we'll tape off the sealing surface and inner surface where it mates to the crankshaft, and give it a coat of paint. I started trying to paint it outside, but it was very windy that day, so it wasn't really practical. So instead we'll be painting in the garage with the door partway open and the balancer hanging off of the engine crane. The paint we're using for this, and almost every other part we'll be putting on this engine, is this Rust-Oleum engine enamel. I've been a big fan of this paint ever since using it to paint the Blazers engine. You do have to let parts sit for a while to let it fully cure, but it seems to be a pretty hardy coating that isn't super picky about surface prep. It also helps that this is about the cheapest engine paint I could get my hands on. As you can see, it's a little bit weird to apply this as it's almost exactly the same color as the bare sandblasted surface. The color we're using is cast coat aluminum. Basically, it's made to look just like bare cast aluminum. Of course, the balancer isn't aluminum, but that color seems to match really well to any bare metal coming out of the sandblaster. So get used to this color because you will be seeing a lot of it in the near future. We'll give the balancer 3 or 4 coats and let it hang dry for as long as possible. In this case, it was hanging off a shelf for a couple of days. Next up to get that same treatment is this old power steering pump pulley. This is actually one that we had previously removed from the '78 Firebird and was on that car when I first bought it. It clearly has some years on it and has seen some better days. At this point, I wasn't entirely sure, but it seemed like this would be the correct offset pulley for the power steering pump on the 454. So while cleaning up all these other parts, it only made sense to do this one too. Besides, it seemed like it would be a pretty fun transformation to see this thing put through the sandblaster. So we'll drop that in there and get to work. The rest was a little bit more than just on the surface, and that pulley was fairly pitted. And after about 10 minutes of thorough blasting, this is the part we ended up with. The front of the pulley bears a striking resemblance to the cratered surface of the moon. There isn't a single smooth area on the face of this pulley. Something interesting is that with the part stripped down to bare metal, you can clearly see the brazing compound that is holding the center of the pulley to the stamped sheet metal. Unfortunately, due to the rust damage, I didn't have any expectations that I would be able to paint this pulley and have it come out looking like new. I considered filling in the pits with something like JB Weld and smoothing it all over, but I ended up deciding that the character that this thing had was maybe even more interesting. Also, that sounds like a lot of work, and when the pulley flexes under load, it might come off anyway, I don't really know. We'll polish the inner surface with Scotch-Brite to make sure it can slide over the power steering shaft the way it needs to, and then thoroughly clean it with our favorite soap and water bucket. With that rinsed and sprayed dry, we'll tape off the center and hang it up ready for paint. Just like the balancer, we'll give it a few coats of engine enamel and then let it dry for at least a couple of days. The pitted surface is still clearly visible, so it's not necessarily a looker, but it sure has character, and I don't think it's been appreciably weakened from the rust. The absolute best thing about using this pulley versus going out and buying one is that we already have this one. So, as long as that pulley aligns correctly with everything else, we will be using it. Similar to that pulley, it seems like the next parts we'll be cleaning have also been through a lot. These are the aluminum valve covers that I bought for the engine off of eBay. These are OEM Chevy covers and what would have come on our Gen 5 454 from the factory. We'll be giving each of the covers a scrub down in the parts washer, and as part of that process we need to remove this PCV grommet. The rubber has become pretty hard and it's really in there, so this was easier said than done. But with a bit of prying and determination we were able to pull that out. We'll go over the cast aluminum covers with a stainless steel wire brush and degreaser and try to get them as clean as possible. There was some oil residue, especially on the inside, but most of the ugliness is just the flaking old paint. I decided to try rinsing these off to get out the degreaser and hoping that maybe some more paint would come off. And when drying them off afterwards with the blowgun, we were definitely able to make some of that happen. Some fairly big chunks of paint were coming off, which will save us time later on. Considering what's happened to all of the other parts in this video, it should be no surprise that we're dropping these into the sandblasting cabinet. This is a little bit of a tricky one because I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone because there are little baffles inside of the covers that will be hard to clean. Using the sandblaster, we can get the outside looking really nice, but any sand that ends up stuck in the inside that we can't get loose in the cleaning process could work its way into our oiling system. So we'll have to be super vigilant when cleaning these off. One of them is quite a bit patchier looking than the other, so you can really tell which one I spent more time with. Since these are also going to get painted, I figured those minor surface color discrepancies wouldn't end up mattering. With them really clean like this, you can make out some casting imperfections and dings that really weren't visible otherwise. Those are probably going to show up in the final painted product, but I'm not that worried about it. They are looking pretty good. We'll put each of the valve covers through a very thorough cleaning process, then we'll spray them dry, and cover them in plastic wrap to keep them clean. There's just one more part that we'll be cleaning in this video, and it's one that we haven't really talked about yet. We'll be covering it in excruciating detail after the engine build, but this is the supercharger that will be topping it off. I bought it as an extremely well-used set off of eBay, and this is the intake manifold that came with it. Much like the valve covers, it has been painted black in the past, and a lot of it is coming off. I can't say for sure what's happened to this manifold in the past, but it's pretty safe to say that it's been through a lot. There's this big old puddle of weld at the rear of the intake manifold where there was clearly a crack. You can still see it on the inside of the manifold. It doesn't appear that it was stop drilled, so I'm just going to go ahead and hope that it doesn't propagate any farther in the future. For what it's worth, the repair does seem strong, and that top flange surface where the supercharger mounts is still flat. It's interesting that the paint is over top of that weld, which seems to suggest that this thing was running and working after this occurred. Overall, the manifold exists, and I feel like it could have been worse. So while everything else is set up for it, we will clean this thing up and sandblast it. The only thing we have to do first is remove 3 plugs from the manifold. The first is a vacuum plug going into this intake runner. The second is another vacuum plug tucked away at the rear of the manifold. And the third is this coolant passage plug towards the front. Once all of those have been removed, we'll drop it into the cabinet. This one took quite a while because, well, the paint was actually fairly sturdy, but there was also just a huge amount of surface area to deal with. So after that time in the sand spa, this is what we came out with. Those dark areas on the valley rails are actually RTV that I didn't even realize was still stuck to it. We'll use a razor blade scraper to take that off on both the rear and front rails of the intake, and we'll flip it over to get out a few little bits of sealer or rubber that were stuck in the upper O-ring seal surface. When we put it back together, we won't be using an O-ring seal, but we still may as well get everything as clean as we can. After scraping it, we went back through and did one final pass to get off any last little remnants. Then all we have to do is shake loose the sand and get the best look at the manifold we've had yet. With all that old paint out of the way, it's looking really nice. The intake definitely still has some battle scars, but at least now we're starting with a bare metal part. Even the logo on the back of the manifold is looking a heck of a lot better. We can also take a better look at the weld, and while it's not the prettiest in the entire world, it also seems like it'll be strong enough for what it is. Now that the manifold is looking pretty spiffy, we'll go through with thread chasers and clean out all of the threads on it. Some of them weren't looking so good, but I didn't realize exactly how bad they were until later, so we'll be dealing with those after the engine is assembled. To clean up the NPT threads, we'll use a pipe tap and tighten it just enough to lightly scratch the surface. We don't really want to cut them any deeper, just clean up what's already there. And once we've gone through the many threaded holes on the manifold, we'll take it out to the soap and water buckets. This is a pretty complicated part, so I made sure to take a lot of time and care in cleaning it. And we'll thoroughly dry it off before wrapping it for storage. It was a fair amount of work, but it's pretty satisfying to see all of the parts that we were able to restore in this episode. The before and after of the sandblasting process is kind of magical, really. The tools are a bit bulky and the setup is a bit time consuming, but when everything comes together, we sure do get some nice looking parts out of it.